the negotiations with Prigozhin, which itself, in a sense, is a humiliation for Putin, who claims to be the leader of the greatest state ever. And for Putin, it was always the biggest threat that revolution or civil unrest will happen in Russia. And that's what we have been seeing throughout the day. So now Putin will have to do something to somehow restore his faith, and at least to restore some part of the control, because clearly for everyone now he is not in the control of the situation. And this might lead to a greater terror in Russia. This might lead to something that Russia will do to Ukraine, and other strikes to Ukraine to distract attention from the situation in Russia. So I think that in the upcoming hours we will see something happening, but probably this won't be something that will cheer people up.
Maria, you are an expert in Russian disinformation. President Putin is the king of Russian disinformation. What does he say now? How does he spin things now to maintain power, to maintain control?
Well, Russian state media were fully involved in all of the situation from the early morning, and it was obvious that there is a chaos, and they are not fully aware of what is happening, but they wanted to make this image that the state and Putin and Kremlin are in control of the situation. So for now they will try to convene to Russian citizens that they are fully controlling everything what is happening in Russia, and the situation is ruled out and nothing to worry about. But of course this is not true, and the main Russian military leadership will see some consequences after this coup, and I think that we will see something happening to Shoigu and Gerasimov as well.
Maria Avdiva, thank you so much. We have got a lot more coming up, folks. You're watching MSNBC. Our second hour starts right now. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Yasmin Vasukin. If you're just joining us, welcome. If you've been sticking with us, we're thankful for that. We have got a lot of developments in Russia as the head of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, says his mercenary group is turning back and abandoning its march towards Moscow. He made that announcement after the president of Belarus claimed he held talks with Prigozhin. Want to bring in NBC's Matt Bodner, who's standing by for us and tracking this all. Matt, you heard this thing firsthand. Talk us through what you heard from Prigozhin and the revelation of this quote-unquote deal.
Thank you, Yasmin. Well, obviously, it was a very shocking development after what has been, as we've discussed, a very astonishing 24 hours in Russia. So we heard another audio message from Prigozhin. He speaks very intensely, kind of always. It's part of his charm, for lack of a better word. We saw that, again in this latest message, but also a little bit, taking a step back. He's admitting that he's stepping down, saying that they've come to some kind of agreement, and he doesn't want to be responsible for spilling Russian blood. And he kind of understood that they had reached the point where that was going to come to a head. So the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, claiming credit for this. We actually just heard a little bit more from the Belarusian state media about what actually happened there. Lukashenko and Putin, according to the Belarusian state media, spoke about an hour ago about the situation in which Vladimir Putin thanked Lukashenko for his role in defusing the situation, or at least that's how they're describing it. As you mentioned, there's still a lot of questions about whether this will stand and what is actually going on here. But essentially, President of Russia, according to the state media report right now, supported and thanked his Belarusian counterpart for the work done in handling this situation with the Wagner PMC. Now, I would say that doesn't necessarily look great on the Kremlin. So we're essentially, if you read between the lines here, we're seeing what appears to be an admission that Putin did not speak with Prigozhin directly. He wasn't even naming Prigozhin in public. And I think it just kind of, it's hard to see that this is actually over, because the fundamental issues at play here apparently are unresolved. Prigozhin went into this with some very, in the Russian context, incendiary, I would argue unforgivable rhetoric, questioning the entire war aims, things that if anybody else in Russia said could land them in jail. And in the way he did it, I think really inflamed and will continue to inflame nationalist pro-war sentiment. And this is a problem that the Kremlin has, I think, been increasingly struggled to manage, especially as Prigozhin's become more vocal in recent weeks and months with these criticisms of how the war has been operated. There's this sense in Russia sometimes you get that there's maybe a betrayed soldier narrative akin to some of the stuff we saw in Germany after World War I. This sense that the government lost the war, the soldiers were putting up a good fight, and the government, corrupt generals, lost the war. And Prigozhin channels that rhetoric effectively, and when he says these things, he receives a lot of support from pro-war Russian bloggers, who are really one of the biggest voices in the Russian media space now about the war. And so I don't think that those issues are resolved here. There's nothing in these reports from Lukashenko about those issues, and we're just, there's mechanics that we have to see. Do they pull out of Rostov? Where do they go from here? And on the whole, I think President Putin, at the end of this 24 hours, looks weaker than he has looked since he entered power. This does not seem like a very well-managed situation. Everything we've seen from the Russian government over the past 24 hours very much seems coming from a place of a defensive place, on the back foot, kind of winging it, unsure how to address it. So we'll see where things go from here, Yasmin.
Yeah,
but it does not appear that many of these issues have been addressed.
Yeah, and again, and as I talked about in the last hour with you, along with other guests as well, we haven't heard about the fate of Gerasimov. We haven't heard about the fate of Shoigun, the defense minister, either. And that is specifically who Prigozhin called out by name. I'm wondering, Matt, if you could tell me about some of the reports that I'd been hearing as the Wagner group, mercenary group, advanced. There were not many people standing in their way. I was seeing reports that the Russian military were standing by and letting them pass through. Is that what you were seeing as well? And what does that say about the support for the current regime in Russia and their war in Ukraine?
Well, this is a great question. I think it actually says a lot. We've, of course, we've been seeing these reports. There's interestingly no video necessarily of that. I guess today, during the day, we saw a video out of Rostov that showed Wagner troops in proximity of Russian troops, and they were not fighting. But Prigozhin himself claims that he took that military command in Rostov without a fight, and they've in the entire kind of at every step along the way, from the moment they hit the border, moved into Rostov, and continued on, they continued to make claims that they were seeing very little resistance from police, from conscripts, from just about everybody below the officer level. And I think that speaks to kind of what I was bringing up with the pro-war military bloggers and this kind of, for lack of a better word right now, betrayed soldier narrative. I think in the lower ranks, the guys who are being sent to the front, there is sympathy for the things Prigozhin is saying, and he presents himself as this kind of nationalist everyman who's been in the trenches. Yeah. So it would have been interesting to see.
Yeah, Matt Bodner for us. Thank you. Want to bring in now John Brennan, former director of the CIA, to talk more about this. Director Brennan, thanks for joining us on this. We appreciate it. I want you to give us first a 30,000-foot view take on this whole thing and how astounding the last 24 hours have been, watching this advance it seemed that Prigozhin was making on Moscow, and now this potential quote-unquote deal he has struck with Belarusian President Lukashenko.
Well, Yasmin, the events are fast unfolding. And I think, as Matt mentioned, I think we still are going to be seeing a fair amount of developments in the coming days and weeks that will determine exactly the reverberations and the impact of this event. But clearly, this has been, I think, a humiliating embarrassment for Vladimir Putin. I think it's demonstrated weakness. I mean, the fact that this deal was struck by Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, with Prigozhin. But it's clear that Prigozhin was, moving from his rhetorical blasts and broadsides against the mainstream Russian military to actually doing something on the ground by moving his columns and convoys up toward Moscow. And in history, sometimes a failed or aborted coup, and that's certainly what it was looking like, at least, they fail or they are aborted because anticipated support does not materialize. And maybe Prigozhin was counting on some of the Russian military units to provide support to him, communications or supply, logistics, armored units, as well as maybe air, or maybe even some of his own forces were rather hesitant to continue to move into what was going to be, I think, a bloody battle in Moscow. But I do think that Putin needs to restore an image of strength. I know that there's been speculation about maybe Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of General Staff General Gerasimov might be removed. But these are two individuals who have been very loyal to Putin. They've been in place for over a decade. I think if he were to remove them now, at least immediately, it would show that he's basically capitulating to Prigozhin's demands. That's not going to, I think, show an image of strength and being in control. I do not think that he's going to be able to ever forgive Prigozhin, even though he's not named him explicitly. But Prigozhin certainly has, I think, cast his lot. And if Putin is going to restore this image of strength, which I think he really wants to, and he relies on that image, he always has, he's going to have to take action against Prigozhin, which is maybe the rest or something else. But I do think this situation is still unfolding, and I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. And I think one of the things that Putin has to determine is who can he trust at this point? And I'm sure over the last 24 hours, he was asking that question of which members of his inner circle, as well as which military commanders was he going to be able to trust to be able to put down what really did look like a rebellion by Prigozhin.
And for a long time, he thought that he could trust Prigozhin, and obviously that is not the case. Why would Prigozhin, though, strike this deal if he did not get assurances that Gerasimov and Shoigu would step down, considering those were the two names that were, in fact, called out? Otherwise, he will be a total target of the Russian president. There's no way Putin is going to allow him to stick around.
I agree, but also I think it was because he felt as though he wasn't able to prosecute this coup or this rebellion effectively. He stepped down or reversed course because I think he felt as though he was not going to be a winner on this. And so again, whether or not he was counting on some support from other military units, that just it didn't happen. But I don't think the deal that was struck with Lushenko is going to be something that Prigozhin is going to be able to walk away as a winner. That's not something that Putin will allow, even if Putin might have agreed in this unwritten or unspoken agreement to do certain things. Putin has gone back on his word before, and he's not going to want to emerge from this as looking weak, as submissive, and as somebody who, again, gave in to Prigozhin, because that would only encourage others, I think, to do the same thing.
Dr. Brennan, if you were advising the president right now from an intelligence perspective, what would you be telling him watching this all play out and the kind of geopolitical implications of it all?
Well, I think I say that it's still very unsettled. I think we'll be trying to get a handle on exactly what is happening inside the Kremlin, throughout the country, what the impact is on the broader Russian military, what's the impact as far as the war fighting in Ukraine, what we should be doing in support of Ukraine, maybe to take advantage of the opportunity now, but also keeping a very close eye on the strategic assets of Russia, its nuclear inventory, missiles, and other types of things. But again, I think this is still very, very unsettled. And what happens in the coming days and weeks, I think, again, will determine the course and whether or not Putin is going to be able to survive this politically as well as just personally, because this is the most serious challenge he's ever faced. It's a humiliating defeat, not only in the eyes of the Russian people, but also in the eyes of the world. And that's something that I'm sure Putin just wants to be able to reverse. And we're going to see whether or not he's going to be able to demonstrate the strength that I think is needed in order to restore his image inside of Russia.
John Brennan, former director of the CIA. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Yasmin.
We're going to continue to follow the latest developments out of Russia, everybody, throughout the hour. Coming up in just 60 seconds' time, how pivotal is this moment for Russian President Putin's control of the country? I'm going to ask Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and the host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, Andrea Mitchell, coming up next.
Your Verizon.
Welcome back, everybody. A fast-moving and stunning turn of events today as we're getting breaking new developments out of Russia. Putin's one-time key military ally, Wagner Group chief Prigozhin now standing down his Moscow advance after an attempted rebellion. The Belarus government releasing a statement moments ago saying negotiations lasted the entire day, but no specifics on any deal that may have been struck. Joining me now on the phone is Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent, the host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, my friend, as always, it is great to talk to you. I know you've been watching this as closely, if not more so than I have. It is astounding what we have seen really over the last 24 hours. And as Director Brennan just said to me, this is the most serious challenge that Russian President Vladimir Putin has ever seen to his leadership in Russia over his last 2+ decades.
That's absolutely right. Of course, John Brennan has watched this so closely over the years, but none of us have seen anything like this. This is unprecedented. For Vladimir Putin to go on national television and acknowledge that he is being challenged to call Prigozhin a traitor, to call this treason, to say that this is like the Civil War of 1917 in Russia, to call on people to rally around him, is to acknowledge weakness. And Vladimir Putin does not acknowledge weakness. So however this turns out, with Prigozhin now turning around, we understand, backing off. If this has in fact been negotiated temporarily, if possible, by Lukashenko in Belarus, there's an irremediable, irreparable damage done to Putin's leadership and his primacy. And how this plays out in the future really remains to be seen.
It's interesting, Andrea, because I heard you on earlier, and I watched Putin's address live as well. And having been in Moscow myself, reported there as well, I've watched many addresses from him, and he seemed off kilter. He seemed nervous. He didn't seem like the confident Vladimir Putin that we have come to know, which might speak to where he is right now, psychologically, considering this most recent revolt.
Absolutely. And there are reports, and we have not confirmed this, but reports of potential changes in the military leadership within the Kremlin to try to placate Prigozhin. Something persuaded Prigozhin to back down. And whatever that was, it could have been some concessions that we don't yet know that possibly came from Putin through Lukashenko. One obvious concern has to be for the United States: where are the strategic assets? Where are the tactical nuclear weapons? How secure is the command and control? That's something that we always have to be wary of, even with just the war in Ukraine and the potential threats. So, the threats that Putin was voicing about using, the worst possible weapons. And now we don't know what Putin might do. I don't think he would ever use nuclear weapons against his own people with Prigozhin on Russian territory. But he will, I don't think, stop at anything down the road to try to consolidate his power, reconsolidate his power.
Andrea, how shocked were you to hear that this deal was even struck by A, Lukashenko, but B, it was struck within 24 hours of Prigozhin's advance on Moscow, considering the rhetoric that has already been put out there, considering how vulnerable he has now made himself, and understanding we don't even know those terms yet. We don't know if, in fact, Lukashenko, through Putin, has agreed to, the stepping down of Gerasimov and Shoigu, which is what Prigozhin wanted. How shocked were you by that? How surprised were you by that?
Very, and I think from the officials I've spoken to, they were as well. Experienced Russia hands are surprised by all of this. And that's why I believe that if it is true that Prigozhin has, backed off and compromised, he's gotten something in return, and it's probably Gerasimov and Shoigu's heads on a stick.
Yeah.
And we don't know yet whether there was actually an organized Russian military attack on his own Wagner forces. Prigozhin has been the tip of the spear for Vladimir Putin beyond Ukraine, throughout other continents in Africa and elsewhere. And so he's been prosecuting, Russian foreign policy in Syria and elsewhere, and doing it in the most brutal possible fashion. We're talking about two very brutal characters here. It's hard to know whom you would root for in all this.
Yeah. Andrea Mitchell-Forrest, as always, my friend, thank you. Of course, you can always watch Andrea Mitchell Reports every Monday through Friday, noon Eastern, right here on MSNBC. Still ahead, everybody, a live report from Ukraine on how officials are responding to the Russian infighting that we have seen today, plus how the U.S. and other allies could assist Ukrainian troops in what could be a crucial moment in that war. I'm going to speak to Alexander Vindman, former director of European Affairs for the U.S. National Security Council, coming up. We'll be right back.
When it comes to your hair, ingredients matter. That's why Herbal Essences is packed with naturally derived plant ingredients you love. And none of the stuff you don't. Our sulfate-free collections smell incredible. And leave your hair touchably soft and smooth. Herbal Essences.
I'm Richard Karn, and I love my hose. My hose is lightweight.
Oh, no.
My hose will not kink.
Come on!
And my hose is anti-leak. It ain't those old hoses. This is my hose. The new Pocket Hose Copper Bullet, now infused with real copper, so your water is always clean and lead-free. Just turn on the water and watch your hose grow and grow to a full-size 3/4-inch hose. And when you turn off the water, away it goes, shrinking and squeezing that water out until it's practically bone dry. Our new inner tube uses 3 layers of high-strength latex on the inside. Then it's wrapped in a new polymer filament jacket, the same technology used in forest fire hoses because it's light and tough. 3 times stronger than the other hoses. It's guaranteed for 10 years. Nearly impossible to tear or snag. And the redesigned connector protector with flexible collar helps stop leaks at the spigot. But my favorite part of our new hose build, the oversized, easy-to-grip fittings. Easy on and off, even with gloves. Perfect for power washing cars and trucks, ready to go anywhere, even your pocket. With more than 100 patents worldwide, it's the best pocket hose in the world. Get the super light 25-foot pocket hose Copper Bullet today for only $29.99. But wait, call now and get our Turbo Shot adjustable nozzle. From those delicate flowers to power washing your walkway, a $20 value, absolutely free. Copper Bullet is not available in stores. This is an exclusive advanced release of our 2024 edition pocket hose. There is a strict limit of 3 per order. Don't wait, order now.
Call 1-800-261-6443. That's 1-800-261-6443. Or visit copperbullet.hose.com. So call 1-800-261-6443 now.
This is not the first all-electric car. That's because no BMW sees the road until it's reached the ultimate standard, our own. A standard that demands every BMW feels exactly like a BMW should. Unparalleled performance and precision handling made possible by electric engineering. But isn't that what you'd expect from the ultimate electric driving machine? Hurry in to lease the 2024 BMW iX xDrive 50 for $929 per month.
I'm Mr. Wonderful, and I'm bird watching. The only reason I have time to search for the rare vermilion flycatcher is because my companies have already received money from the Employee Retention Credit Program. Filing for that money takes a lot of time. Time I'd rather spend doing what I love, like waiting for a glimpse of a red-legged honey creeper. Gotcha, buddy. So do what I did. Go to wondertrust.com to see if your business qualifies for up to $26,000 per employee.
Do you have a box of videotapes, film reels, or photos that are degrading?
Legacy Box professionally converts them to DVDs, thumb drive, or the cloud.
Legacy Box is simple and safe, with over 1 million satisfied customers.
Visit legacybox.com.
When you need brutal honesty, when you need answers first thing in the morning, when you need to go deep inside Washington and hear from someone who's been there. You Need Your Morning Joe, weekdays at 6, only on MSNBC.
Do you think he's actually running his caucus, or do you think someone else is?
Judge Thomas is really quite outrageous, and I think it needs to be investigated.
By the Department of Justice?
Yes.
Inside with Jen Psaki, Sundays at noon on MSNBC.
All right, welcome back. Today's remarkable reversal by the Wagner Group came in part supposedly from Yevgeny Prigozhin's desire to avoid shedding Russian blood, but he has never had a problem spilling Ukrainian blood. With that, I want to bring in NBC's Raf Sanchez, who is with us again from the capital city of Kyiv. Raf, the Ukrainians, they've been pointing with pride in recent days to their counteroffensive. Any sense yet as to what happens now with the war?
Yeah, it's been probably still too early to say, but I can tell you President Zelensky and his team have been incredibly closely tracking what's been going on inside Russia. And as you can imagine, their hope has been that with the Russians apparently divided amongst themselves, that there might be an opening for Ukrainian forces mounting this counteroffensive in the south and in the east. At this point, we don't have any firm evidence that the Ukrainians have been able to exploit these openings, that they have made a lot of progress on the battlefield in these confusing last 24 hours or so. We haven't heard from President Zelensky since Prigozhin said he was backing down, but we did hear from him several times throughout the day. And he was kind of taunting the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, and he was also trying to speak directly to both the Russian people and to Russian soldiers. And Yasmin, as you know, Zelensky is from the east of the country. Russian is his native language. And I want to read you a little bit of a statement he made earlier in Russian. He said, "The man from the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, is obviously very afraid and probably hiding somewhere and not showing himself. I am sure he's no longer in Moscow." So Zelensky there saying he doesn't believe the Kremlin's claims that Putin is staying in the Russian capital. And he goes on to say, "And the longer he can run between his bunkers, the more you will lose, you who are connected with Russia." Wow. So you can imagine President Zelensky there, the president of Ukraine, trying to speak to these frontline Russian soldiers, saying, listen, your leaders are fighting amongst themselves. They're asking you to fight in these trenches. Is this really something you want to be doing?
Hey,
Yes.
Raf, just quickly here, we don't have a lot of time. So Prigozhin essentially saying he's returning to his columns when saying he was backing off. Any word, any reporting that he is returning to Ukraine?
That seems to be the implication. He says that his forces are returning to their bases, most of which are here in Ukraine. We don't know exactly which parts of the line these Wagner troops who were marching towards Moscow came off of. The Ukrainians, as you can imagine, would love to know, because those presumably are weakened parts of the Russian line right now. But it seems to be, from this message, he seems to be saying his forces are returning to the fight here in Ukraine. But we'll have to very closely watch, see if they leave that southern city of Rostov before they come back here.
Yeah,
Yes,
Raf Sanchez for us. Thank you. All right, coming up next, everybody, the retreat of this rebellion in Russia. It's raising a lot of questions about where the loyalties of other Russian security forces may lie. So could we see other groups follow? Could this be an opening for them? I'm going to ask former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, next about that and much, much more. We will be right back. All right, welcome back. We want to get the view from Europe on the apparent end of the rebellion against Russia by the Wagner Group. NBC News foreign correspondent Ali Arouzi is in London for us. Ali, we know that the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, they had been in touch with G7 partners when the mercenaries were heading towards Moscow. Is Europe now exhaling on any level?
Yeah, well, they are and they aren't. I mean, anything that's not good for Vladimir Putin would be welcomed amongst the G7 countries in Europe. They would like to see some sort of pushback on him. They'd like to see the war not go in his way, but not necessarily for the Wagner Group to suddenly take up the position in the Kremlin. So yes, there is a sigh of relief that this hasn't blown out into some enormous chaotic situation that spills into borders borders that Russia has so many porous borders of with Europe. But it will be a disappointment that it looks like Putin again has the upper hand after all of this. So probably a mixed bag of feelings here in Europe, that maybe they've averted some huge disaster that couldn't have been contained if this became some sort of civil war in Russia that spilt out. But again, there's got to be a level of disappointment that Putin manages to ride out so many of these storms. And, you know, this morning, this was looking really, really bad for Putin as the Wagner group was advancing towards Moscow. Now this big retreat, you're wondering where Prigozhin's political and military future is. Probably not very secure given Putin's taste for revenge. And here in Europe, they're going to be watching the situation very, very closely over the next few hours, days and weeks to see how loyal the security services and the National Guard in Russia remain to Putin, as now we've seen some chinks in his armor.
Key complicated allies, Iran and China, to Russia. What do we know about any conversations either of those two leaders had with President Putin, and why they would be watching this play out so closely?
Well, these are two key allies of Russia. These are two partners that they can rely on. I mean, we just saw Secretary Blinken went to China on a goodwill mission, and before he even got back to the States, President Biden was calling President Xi a dictator. Putin can rely on Xi not to call him out in public. He can rely on him on support. He can rely on the Iranians to keep providing them with drones to fight that war. And it's a mutual relationship. The Iranians, the last thing they want to see is Vladimir Putin gone. They can rely on him for immense amounts of support when it comes to countering the United States for a vote on the Security Council. So these guys have a relationship. They rely on their own powers staying in place, and it is not to their benefit to see somebody like Putin go. So they will be watching the situation very closely, especially given that they had a massive uprising in Iran towards the end of the last year. Very different to what's happening here in Russia. There was no 25,000 armed troops, you know, going up against Iran's supreme leader, or potentially going up against them. But the situations are also similar in many ways, and they rely on their own authoritarianism in both countries to prop one another up.
Ali Arouzi for us. Thank you for breaking that down. We appreciate it. Want to bring in now former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, to talk more about this. Ambassador Taylor, thanks for joining us on this. Give me first kind of a big picture view. Right, you've been watching this whole thing very closely play out, and now these latest developments that we are hearing of the Wagner Group standing down. What do you make of it all?
So, Yasmin, this is a demonstration of chaos in the Kremlin. This is a demonstration that President Putin is really in charge. He's got big problems across his various ministries and across his various supporters, or he thought supporters. So that's the main message, that President Putin has trouble at home. And that's the other big picture is that's good news for Ukraine. Ukraine has been readying its forces, probing, trying to find the weak links in the line up and down the Russian line, where the Russians have been trying to defend against this big counteroffensive, and they've had to pull troops out in order to probably counter the Prigozhin. Prigozhin says he's now moving back towards Ukraine. It's not clear how far he's going to go. It's not at all clear what Prigozhin has agreed to or with whom he's agreed. So all to say that this is the big picture is Putin is in trouble, has weathered the storm for the moment, but he's got big problems. And the other thing is the Ukrainians are preparing their counteroffensive.
So if not today, if not tomorrow, Ambassador Taylor, you and I have spoken about this multiple times, and I've asked you this question multiple times, which is, what is the off-ramp for Ukrainians, right? When does this actually end? When does Russia admit defeat? Could this feasibly be the beginning of an off-ramp for the war in Ukraine?
It could, Yasmin. If Putin has the difficulties that I just described. If Prigozhin is shown to be, is clearly not a strong player in the defense of this line that the Russians are trying to hold in Ukraine, if the morale of the Russian soldiers is as bad as it must be, as they have been, it's been shown that that the Russian chain of command is in disarray. And it's been shown that some of the Russian units have been pulled off the line to go back into Russia to defend itself against Prigozhin. All of those indicate that there's an opportunity for the Ukrainians to push through this counteroffensive and to get into the Russian rear. And get into a place there where the Russians, and you asked what ends this? Yeah. This ends when President Putin realizes that he's lost in Ukraine. And he tries to come up with some kind of an agreement. When he decides, when he realizes, when he concludes that he's lost, and then he will try to get something out of some kind of a negotiation.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, thank you so much. Great to talk to you, sir.
Thank you.
Coming up, everybody, looking more into the new reaction from Ukrainian President Zelensky to the Russian mercenary rebellion, calling it, quote unquote, complete chaos. We're going to look at what the Wagner Group wants with Ukraine and how Kyiv takes advantage of this chaos. Coming up next.
Story.
Welcome back, everybody. World leaders closely watching the developments in Russia as Putin saw what initially appeared to be the biggest threat to his power since taking office. I want to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former director of European Affairs for the U.S. National Security Council. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I know that you're on your way to Ukraine, not because of what's happening right now, but you had pre-planned this trip, so we appreciate you talking to us on your layover there. What is going on here? Why would Prigozhin take a deal like this, even though we don't know what is in the deal, considering the possible threat to his life now, considering what has taken place over the last 24 hours?
For having me on. First of all, I think we're not seeing the end of the story. Certainly, Prigozhin is sophisticated enough to recognize that if he isolates himself in an area, if he goes back to Ukraine, he is subjecting himself to being eliminated by the Russians. Putin, at the same time, cannot contend with the possibility of Prigozhin maintaining power and conducting another one of these operations that threaten Putin's regime. So we're not seeing the end of it. But as to why we're here, this is a long-running feud between Prigozhin and the Chief of the General Staff and Minister of Defense. They've been trying to pin him back as Prigozhin has become increasingly aggressive and criticizing these two military leaders for ineffectively running the war. And finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was that the Minister of Defense signed a regulation that subordinated all of these private armies to the Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin looks like within the past couple of weeks may have started to consider the idea of what he needs to do to protest that movement. His actions were, frankly, irrational, putting himself in enormous danger. But he decided to, it looks like, seize the Southern Military District headquarters as a bargaining chip. He was extremely successful, unopposed, and probably, kind of maybe even on the fly, decided to move towards Moscow to strengthen his position. I don't think, and he may very well have achieved his goal of getting President Putin to agree to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov. Yeah. Whether that happens is dubious, but I think that's where we are right now.
So do you think that promise was made to Prigozhin to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov?
I think so. I think the fact is that Prigozhin, in a lot of ways, sees himself or saw himself as the loyal lieutenant. That he was basically, counseling the king that the reason that the war is not going well is because of these other elites that were not effectively conducting their job, and he may very well have received that kind of assurance and security guarantees, but whether Putin follows through is highly, highly dubious.
What do you make of the fact that Prigozhin was, it seemed, unopposed as he made his way towards Moscow? What type of support does he have, do you know, inside the Russian military? And how integral is that to what happens in the next couple of weeks as we watch this thing play out?
So this was, in fact, probably a one-shot deal for Prigozhin to be able to conduct this kind of operation. The Russian state will be better prepared for it. But thus, what Prigozhin did was what he's been successful in doing in other kind of insurrections that his private military corporations have been successful in Africa, for instance. And he seized surprise, he seized speed to achieve his objectives in an area where Russia is frankly weak because it's so committed heavily to Ukraine. It only has paramilitary forces that are good for riot control, for kind of slightly maybe counter special operations forces, but not heavily armed, hardened military units. And I think the fact is that there was an element of self-preservation with all the units that Prigozhin was encountering, Wagner was encountering. They were not going to go up against tanks and these heavily armed formations. And the Air Force, that looks like it did, some 6 or 7 combination of planes and helicopters were shot down. You know, the biggest takeaway for me from this is this is not the end of the story. Each oligarch will look to secure their position potentially through the idea of securing small armies. We've entered a period of war, this Russia-Ukraine war, of immense instability. A lot of opportunity for Ukraine. Ukraine could seize the momentum from the gaps in command and control and probably secure some territory, but it's a hugely unstable period of time. And somewhat foreseeable, frankly, based on the fact that Russia has been losing this war, for pretty much the past year.
I asked this question to former Ambassador Bill Taylor, and I want to ask it to you. Do you see this as a possible off-ramp for Ukraine?
It could be an off-ramp, actually. For me, it could end up being an off-ramp, mainly because then there are a number of scapegoats, whether it's Shoigu and Gerasimov, whether it's Prigozhin. Clearly, Putin could come up with any story, on a dime, turn from damning Prigozhin to offering him a sweetheart deal. So it really, it doesn't really take that much of a pretext for Putin to latch onto and pivot away and live to fight another day. This could be the moment, or this could drag out for weeks and weeks while the Ukrainians liberate additional territory. Russia suffers enormous human losses, and then Putin comes up with any number of different scenarios to justify why it wasn't him that lost the war. It was somebody else's fault.
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, safe travels. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Still ahead, everybody, looking more at the Russian Wagner Group leader who, despite backing down, is presenting a massive challenge to Russian President Vladimir Putin. What his past says about what may be to come. We'll be right back. Welcome back. As we have been reporting, breaking new developments after an attempted armed rebellion by just releasing a statement a short time ago claiming that President Lukashenko brokered a deal with Wagner Group chief Prigozhin to stop the advance to Moscow. It is not clear what promises, if any, were made Prigozhin of Moscow. Back with me now is Mark Polymeropoulos, a former senior intelligence officer Europe and Eurasia. He's now a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst, and a lot of titles under his belt. Mark, thanks for joining us once again. From what we know about Prigozhin, how do you see this thing playing out in the next 24 to 48, considering we literally know nothing about this quote-unquote deal and that he is going back to his columns?
Right. So, and literally, as I was about to get on the air right now, once again, my phone blew up with some statements that Prigozhin might have been offered, amnesty or asylum in Belarus. And so, so things are happening very quickly. I think that we really have to kind of figure out, what was the deal? Was it perhaps some kind of, safety for Prigozhin in return for the removal from the Russian military of Shoigu and Gerasimov? This is something that certainly Prigozhin certainly wanted. There's also the question of what happens to the Wagner Group fighters who were involved in combat. Remember, they actually killed today, shot down several Russian aircraft. That was actually combat between Wagner and the Russian Air Force. And so it's a very murky situation, certainly unclear. And I think that, you kind of, you look at it overall is that this is some dysfunction going on within Russia. Where it lands, we don't know. And certainly where Prigozhin ends up, Whether back at his bases or in Belarus, we're gonna find out shortly.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, NBC does not have that reporting about him gaining amnesty in Belarus, but why that would even be something that he would trust, considering Lukashenko's close relationship with Vladimir Putin.
Right. None of this makes, particular sense. And we have to go back to Prigozhin's roots. This was an incredible ally of Vladimir Putin, who, of course, there's famous story. He started off as a hot dog vendor, ended up as a caterer, then, of course, leads this quite influential paramilitary organization, and is integral recently to the war in Ukraine. How the relationship has deteriorated is quite remarkable. But one thing that I think that we will be looking at, particularly from the U.S. intelligence community, is what is the degree of loyalty within the Russian military still to Prigozhin, to the Wagner Group forces, who really were considered kind of the vanguard, the finest fighting force for Russia, which doesn't say much, but for Russia in Ukraine. So. The elements of this deal, we're really going to have to figure out what's going on in the days to come.
Let me ask you this. I know that Vladimir Putin's actually by CIA case officers. There's a real opening here for gaining entry into that circle if you want to gather intelligence on a Russian president who seems very weak right about now. I imagine those conversations are happening inside intelligence circles.
Oh, Yasmin, you're right. I mean, what a time to be a case officer, on the streets of Europe or Central Asia, or even frankly anywhere, because of the Russian diplomatic presence. We're hanging out the shingle, saying that walk-ins, volunteers are welcome, because if you take a look back at your country, what do you see? Do you really want to go back to Moscow? Same thing for Russian military and Russian intelligence officers. So this is a time frankly, for tremendous opportunity with not only the U.S. intelligence community, but our allies as well, to recruit Russians who do want. And you saw actually several weeks ago, the CIA, put out a video actually, noting that volunteers were welcome. So it's the heyday.
What was the objective of that? What was the objective of that, knowing who would see it?
Well, this was fantastic because there was two objectives. One is to actually, try to get volunteers in Moscow or anywhere around the world. But number two was frankly incredible trolling of Russia and Vladimir Putin. If things are so bad in your country that the CIA can put forth on Telegram, what is a channel that's watched by so many Russian security officials, that we think that things are so bad, that's a pretty big statement that Vladimir Putin really can't explain to his people. Now, the Russians actually tried to come back and do one of their own. This is the tit for tat, espionage war. Things are going downhill, and they know it. It's just a question of are they willing to take that step?
How bad are things for Vladimir Putin right now, Mark?
I think it's pretty significant. This is obviously the biggest challenge to his regime. Let's see what happens with this deal. But I think that in a state, particularly an autocratic state, where you rely on the security services, everyone's going to be looking behind their back. There's going to be a great deal of distrust. Who is loyal and who is not. And that's not, the sign of certainly of a healthy country. It never was. But, I think Putin has certainly some dark days ahead. And let's go back one more time. I know we've talked about it during the day. This is the time for Ukraine to take the opportunity. They have their boot on Russia's neck right now within Russia to really move forward.
Mark Polymeropoulos, thank you. And once again, happy birthday. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for spending some time with us on your special day. That wraps it up for me, everybody. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. I'll be back in the chair tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, for more special coverage. You don't want to miss that. MSNBC, our breaking news coverage continues right now with my friend and colleague, Nicole Wallace.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Nicole Wallace. Thank you so much for being here with us. We know there are a lot of places you could get your news today, and we're glad you're joining us. It's 4 p.m. in the East. It's 11 p.m. in Moscow, where we're following breaking news this hour with the latest on the revolt unfolding in Russia. NBC News is confirming that Yevgeny Prigozhin, he's the head of the Wagner Group, which is a private mercenary army in Russia that's done a lot of the fighting in the war in Ukraine, has called for his Moscow-bound convoy to stand down for now. But that's only after advancing to within 120 miles of the city of Moscow, in the biggest threat to Russian President Vladimir Putin's grip on power that we've ever seen. Prigozhin sent a voice note signaling that the forces would stand down, saying the group understands, quote, the responsibility for spilling Russian blood on one of the sides. We are turning back our convoys and going back